On the 1st of November, the pair spotted 31-year-old Noeline Patterson standing next to her car on Canning Highway in East Fremantle. She had run out of petrol as she was returning home after work. Noeline worked as a bar manager at Nedlands Golf Club. Noeline lived with her mother in the verdant suburb of Bicton, on the banks of the Swan River. She was an extremely popular lady, and members described her as charming and polite. She worked as a stewardess for Ansett Airlines for 9 years and spent 2 years as a stewardess on the private jet of corporate tycoon Alan Bond. Noeline worked at a golf club for about a year, until the evening of the 1st of November 1986, when she accepted her spouse's offer in Bern of a kind ride. Noeline did not hesitate to get into the car with the friendly couple. Once inside, she put a knife to her throat, tied it up, and told her not to move, or she would be stabbed. She was taken back to Moorhouse Street, where Birney repeatedly raped her after being gagged and chained to a bed. Kathryn Birney hated Noeline Patterson from the minute she saw her. A beautiful, elegant lady. Noeline was exactly what Kathryn had always dreamed of being. David himself was fascinated by her. Initially, they decided to kill Noeline Patterson that night, but David, for unknown reasons, kept postponing and postponing this murder. However, Kathryn soon realized the real reason for the delays and became furious. She realized that she was losing her man. At one point, she put a knife to her heart and threatened to kill herself if he didn't choose between her and Noeline. Birney kept Noeline imprisoned in the house for 3 days before Kathryn insisted he kill her. David forced a lethal dose of sleeping pills down the girl's throat, and once she passed out, strangled her under Kathryn's watchful eye. The couple took her body to the woods and buried her like the previous victims. Kathryn Birney took great pleasure in throwing sand on the deceased's face. On 5 November, the Birneys abducted 21-year-old Denise Brown as she waited for a bus on the Sterling Highway. Denise was a fun-loving girl who worked part-time as a computer operator in Perth and spent a lot of her free time dancing and nightclubbing. She was renting a flat in the Nedlands with her young man and another couple. Denise had spent the previous night at the Colby Lap Hotel with her friend. The Burns put her in a car outside a cafe in Fremantle. A close friend later said of her, "She was the kind of person who would do anything to help absolutely anyone. She trusted too many people. Perhaps that's why she didn't hesitate before getting into a car with strangers." At knife point, Denise was taken to Willagie's house, chained to the bed, and raped. The next day, she was taken to the pine forests of the town of Wanneroo. On the way, Birney was almost picked up as another victim. After Birney's capture, the 19-year-old student told police how she was offered a lift by 2 men. Later, when she saw pictures of Kathryn and David Birney in the newspapers, the girl said it was them. When the school day was over at the university, the girl was walking along Pinger Road in Venera when a car pulled up beside her. 2 people were sitting in the front and another in the back seat. She later realized that the person in the back was probably Denise Brown. It made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't recognize that car. A man was driving and a woman was in the passenger seat of the car. Me. She asked me if I needed a lift. I replied, "No, I live up the street." I looked in the back seat and saw a small man with short brown hair lying across the seat. I thought it must be their son or daughter sleeping. The person seemed to be asleep, and judging from his hair, he looked like a boy. But for some reason, I thought it was a girl. I told them again that I wanted to walk because walking was good for your health. The man raised his eyes and looked at me for the first time, and then averted his gaze again. By then, more cars had appeared, and I walked on, but they continued to sit in the car. Finally, the car started, and they turned around and drove down Pinger Road towards the main woods. Only when I saw Kathryn Birney's picture did I realize who they were. Someone must have been looking out for me that day. I don't know what would have happened to me if I'd got into that car. While in a secluded forest with no people around, waiting until it got dark, David Birney raped Denise Brown again, right in the car. He and Kathryn then pulled the girl out of the car, and Birney began raping her again. While David was raping Denise, Kathryn shone a torch on them so that both David and herself could see the process. During the rape, he stabbed Denise in the neck. However, Denise Brown did not die immediately. Kathryn Birney, still holding the torch, found a bigger knife and told her lover to stab the girl again. But David needed no prompting. He plunged the knife in until Denise fell at his feet. Convinced that the girl was dead, the Birneys dug a shallow grave and placed the body in it. But the girl did not pass away this time either. While they were sandbagging Denise Brown, she tried to sit up while in her own grave. Then David grabbed an axe and hit the girl's head with it as hard as he could, but the girl withstood this blow as well. When she sat down again, David turned the axe and split her skull. The couple then covered the body with sand. The brutal murder of Denise Brown had a bad effect on Kathryn Birney. She enjoyed the sex she and her husband had with their victims, and she had nothing against abducted women being strangled and stabbed to death. But after the last murder, she decided she couldn't go through it all again. Perhaps that's why she left their next victim, Kate Moyer, untied in a bedroom and unattended. The girl had been forced to call her parents and tell them she was staying at a friend's house. Kathryn put a knife to her throat while David listened to the conversation on another phone in the house. The girl told her parents that she had been drinking heavily and decided to stay over. Earlier, she had not been drinking at all, so she hoped that her parents would suspect something wrong. However, the parents did not suspect anything and just went to bed. The next morning, the Birneys acted as if it was just a normal day for them. David had breakfast and left for work, leaving his wife and Kate Moyer alone in the house. He said that when he got home from work, he and Kathryn would kill Kate. Meanwhile, the morning papers had already published pictures of Denise Brown, who had gone missing the day before. Kate saw the edge of the newspaper with this picture and realized that Denise must be dead. While in the house, the girl saw a medicine bottle on the nightstand with David's name written on it. That's how she learned the full name of her kidnapper. Kate realized that to survive, she needed to gain Kathryn's trust. She tried to be as obedient and sweet as possible, and that plan worked. While David was away, Kathryn and Kate listened to the rock band Dire Straits together and watched the film Rambo on TV. Kathryn became so friendly with Kate that she even took her outside with her. While outside, Kathryn ordered Kate to go into the house by herself and not make a sound, or she would kill her. Kate entered the house and realized that this was her only chance of escape. She broke the window lock and made her way outside. In black leggings, black t-shirts, and panties, the girl knocked on the doors of nearby neighboring houses, but no one came out. Everyone was at work. Then she ran to a shop with Hoovers and saw a guy in a suit at the entrance. Kate ran up to him and told him she had been raped and asked him to shelter her inside. The police then arrived and took her to the Palmyra police station, where Kate was questioned by the only woman on duty, 22-year-old Laura Hancock. It wasn't until July of that year that Laura graduated from the police academy. The police force was understaffed, and she was left alone in the station, poring over papers and answering phones. Kate Moyer's report of kidnapping, rape, and death threats was the first report Laura Hancock took in her life. Kathryn Birney would later tell the police, "I think I must have come to the decision that sooner or later the mess had to end. I got to a stage where I didn't know what to do. I came to the decision that I was willing to give this girl a chance. I knew David would kill her one way or another, and probably do it that very night. I was just sick of killing. I thought that if something didn't happen soon, it would just go on and on and on and never end. Somewhere in the back of my mind was another fear. I was terrified that I would have to see another murder like that of Denise Brown, the girl he had killed with an axe. I wanted to avoid it at all costs. In the back of my mind, I realized that I didn't care if the girl escaped or not. When I learned that the girl had escaped, I felt goosebumps run down my spine. I told myself, David would be furious. What am I going to tell him? On the 12th of November, 1986, David John Birney and Kathryn Margaret Birney stood before Fremantle Magistrates Court and were charged with the premeditated murder of 4 people. There was public outrage at their offenses, and a crowd gathered outside the court. The remand cell in the courtroom was heavily guarded by the police. David Birney was brought into the courtroom, handcuffed to a police officer. He was dressed in faded blue overalls, tracksuit trousers, and socks. Barefoot Kathryn Birney was also handcuffed to a police officer and was wearing blue jeans and a light brown checked shirt. Their faces expressed no emotion as the charges against them were read out. None of them had a lawyer. No motions were made, bail was formally denied, and the Birneys were taken into custody. When Kathryn Birney was asked if she wanted to be arrested for 8 or 30 days before her next court appearance, Kathryn Birney looked at her lover and said, "I'll leave when he leaves." On the 10th of February, 1987, a huge crowd gathered outside the Perth Supreme Court. When Birney arrived in a prison car, the crowd was shouting and demanding the reintroduction of the death penalty. "Hang the bastards!" they shouted. "String them up!" Under a huge police guard, the pair were led into the holding cells. Bill Power, a police reporter who had covered the crimes in Birney's trial for the Perth Daily News, recalls Birney's appearance in Perth High Court as one of the most frightening events of his career and remembers it as vividly as if it were yesterday. There was nothing special about Davidson and Kathryn Birney. When they first appeared in court, when they faced multiple charges of serial murder that ended the mystery of young women disappearing into the quiet streets of Perth, Bill recalled. They were a rather unassuming, ordinary-looking couple, the kind you might find at a petrol station in a provincial town. David was a skinny little man, and Kathryn was his unassuming, slightly pudgy-breasted wife with a very sour face. Both were accompanied by policemen. David Birney was the first to appear at the top of the stairs leading from the remand cell, looking completely out of place in the stately Perth Supreme Court. He was already in the dock, looking around at the pandemonium of police officers, court staff, and a huge contingent of journalists as Kathryn climbed the stairs to the courtroom. The scrawny little serial killer looked mesmerizing enough, but the absolute surprise that no one was prepared for was the appearance of Kathryn Birney on the stairs from Eucalyptus. These stairs led up to the place where the charges were to be read to them. If you've ever seen a feral cat run away, try to imagine the same damn cat in the confined space of a narrow staircase. Kathryn Birney struggled with the police guards and refused to let any of them touch her. She shouted and spat out various swear words at them until she reached her seat and spotted her lover, David. Only then did she calm down. The extraordinary behavior continued again when David Birney stood before a judge to hear the murder charges against him. Kathryn Birney was allowed to sit on a small wooden bench behind him. As the judge read out all the horrifying counts of the indictment, David Birney stood motionless with his hands folded behind his back. What I saw next, I will remember for the rest of my life, Bill Power recalled. As charges of kidnapping, rape, torture, and murder were read against him, Kathryn Birney leaned forward, extended her right hand, and gently stroked the pad of David Birney's thumb while his hands were folded behind his back. Probably never before, in the dock, had the Supreme Court of Western Australia witnessed such a heartfelt declaration of undying love. David Birney pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder and 1 count each of kidnapping and rape, thus sparing the families of his victims the agony of a lengthy trial. "It's the least I could do," he told the detective. Kathryn Birney was not required to appear in court because her lawyer was waiting for a psychiatric report to determine her sanity. She was remanded into custody and was scheduled to appear in court later in the month. It was over in a matter of minutes, Bill Power recalled, and the once angelic Kathryn, who moments before had shown such self-sacrificing love, was now being dragged back down the wooden stairs to the prison truck, and she was once again leering, yelling, and spitting at the police officers who were doing their duty. Perhaps she wished she had never been touched by another man other than David. Judge Wallace sentenced David Birney to the maximum sentence of life in prison, in a maximum security prison. He added, "The law is not strong enough to express society's horror at this sadistic killer who tortured, raped, and murdered 4 women. In my view, David John Birney is such a danger to society that he should never be released from prison." David Birney stood trembling in the dock as his sentence was handed down. His bravado returned as he was led into the prison van under heavy guard. As the angry mob demanded his blood, David Birney put his hand to his lips and sent them an air kiss. Kathryn Margaret Birney, found sane enough to be responsible before the court, admitted her involvement in the murders. She was sentenced on the 3rd of March, 1987, by the Perth High Court. She stood in the dock holding hands with David Birney, the man who had led her down a path of torture, rape, and murder. Throughout the day of the hearing, they chatted quietly and smiled at each other as the court was told of their 35-day reign of terror. Occasionally she would caress and stroke his arm. A psychiatrist told the court that Kathryn Birney was dependent on David Birney and almost completely vulnerable to his harmful influence. He said, "This is the worst case of personal addiction I have seen in my career." Judge Wallace did not hesitate to give Kathryn Birney the same sentence as David Birney. He said, "In my opinion, you should never see David Birney again, and you will never be allowed to see him again." As Kathryn was led away from the courtroom, this skinny mother of 6 took one last look at the man who had affected her life in so many ways. In prison, David Birney was constantly beaten. In late 1987, he attempted suicide. Eventually, he was moved to the old Fremantle prison on death row for his safety. In the years that followed, the Birneys rarely made headlines. They wrote more than 2,600 letters to each other in the first 4 years of their separation. But they were denied the right to marry, make phone calls to each other, or meet. In 1990, David Birney said the denial of these rights carries a penalty beyond what is prescribed by law. He said that he and Kathryn had been physically and mentally tortured, and that denying them contact with each other was an attempt to drive them to mental illness and suicide. In 1992, top detectives from the crime squad gave David Birney the rare privilege of a glimpse of the outside world when they drove him around Perth and the suburbs for 5 hours, in the hope that he might confess to other murders he might have committed. The fact was that there was speculation that the Birneys were involved in more kidnappings and the resulting murders of people. Among them were the disappearances of Cheryl Renwick in May 1986 and Barbara Western in June of that year. There has also been speculation that David was involved in the disappearance of Lisa Marie Mott in 1980. However, nothing ever came of that 5-hour journey. David did not confess to any other offenses. In 1993, his personal computer was confiscated from David Birney's prison cell. This was after it was discovered that the computer had pornographic software installed on it. On 22nd January 2000, Kathryn Birney's first husband and father of her 6 children, Donald McLaughlin, died suddenly in the Western Australian country town of Busselton. He was 59 years old. Kathryn Birney applied to attend her ex-husband's funeral. This was denied. Commenting on the Justice Department's decision to refuse to attend the funeral, Western Australian Premier Richard Court said, "As far as I am aware, the Birneys have forfeited any rights to this kind of privilege." Under Western Australian law, David and Kathryn Birney would be eligible to apply for parole 20 years after they committed their atrocities. But it is unlikely that any parole board will go against the Ols judge's recommendations that the two die behind bars. In January 2000, the acting Attorney General for Western Australia, Kevin Prince, said that while parole for the Birneys might be considered in 2007, he believed they would never be released unless they were too frail or decrepit. Fears about David Birney's release vanished once and for all at 4:30 a.m. on 2 October 2005, when 55-year-old David Birney was found hanged in his high-security cell at Casuarina Prison in Perth. The investigation found that he had hanged himself from a ventilation hatch with a piece of cord. No signs of premeditated murder by third parties were found on his body. Among the reasons given for the suicide were the confiscation of his computer, the denial of his antidepressant medication, and the resulting depression he developed. Suspicions were raised by other inmates. However, a former prison officer described him as a model prisoner who cared for injured animals. Kathryn was barred from attending his funeral. Kathryn Birney is currently incarcerated in Bandiap Women's Prison. Whilst in prison, she worked as a librarian and took part in a prison production of the comedy musical Nonsense. Her application for parole was rejected in 2007. The then Attorney General of Western Australia, Jim McGuinty, said that as long as he held office, Kathryn Birney would not go free. Her case was due to be retried in January 2010. However, on the 14th of March 2009, the new Attorney General for Western Australia, Christian Porter, at the request of the victims' families, decided that Kathryn would remain in prison for life. This decision makes her the third Australian whose case file is labeled as never to be released. Her appeal against this decision was rejected by Porter in March 2010. Kathryn's fourth application for parole was rejected in 2016. In 2016, the last victim of the Birney family to survive an escape, Kate Moyer, launched a campaign to overturn Western Australia's laws that automatically sent convicts to parole every 3 years. In 2017, Kathryn Birney's youngest son, Peter, called for her execution, and he claimed that his relationship with Kathryn Birney led to him being attacked. Peter is a supporter of Kate Moyer's campaign. This was the latest installment in the story of crazy couple David and Kathryn Birney. Share your impressions of this horror story in the comments. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the release of the next stories.